Robert Francis Kennedy, also known as by his initials RFK and by the nickname Bobby, was an American politician and lawyer. He served as the 64th United States Attorney General from January 1961 to September 1964, and as a U.S. Senator from New York from January 1965 until his assassination in June 1968. When he was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, like his brothers John F. Kennedy and Ted Kennedy, he was a prominent member of the Democratic Party and is an icon of modern American liberalism. Kennedy was born into a wealthy political family in Brooklyn, in Massachusetts, after serving in the U.S. Naval Reserve from 1944 to 1946. Kennedy returned to his studies at Harvard University and later received his law degree from the University of Virginia. He began his career as a correspondent for the Boston Post and as a lawyer at the Justice Department, but later resigned to manage his brother John's successful campaign for the U.S. Senate in 1952. The following year, he worked as an assistant counsel to the Senate committee chaired by Senator Joseph McCarthy. He gained national attention as the chief counsel of the Senate Labor Rackets Committee from 1957 to 1959, where he publicly challenged Team Masters President Jimmy Hoffa over the union's corrupt practices. Kennedy resigned from the committee to conduct his brother's successful campaign in the 1960 presidential election. He was appointed United States Attorney General at the age of 35 and one of the youngest cabinet members in the American history. He served as his brother's closest advisor until his latter's assassination in 1963. His tenure is known for advocating for the civil rights movement, the fight against organized crime and the mafia, and the involvement in the U.S. foreign policy related to Cuba. He authored his account of the Cuban Missile Crisis in a book titled The 13 Days. As Attorney General, he authorized his account of the Cuban investigation, the FBI to wiretap Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference on a limited basis. After his brother's assassination, he remained in the office during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson for several months. He left to run for the United States Senate from New York in 1964 and defeated Republican incumbent Kenneth Keating, overcoming criticism that he was a carpetbagger from Massachusetts. In office, Kennedy opposed U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War and raised awareness of poverty by sponsoring legislation designed to lower private business to blighted communities, that is Bedford Stuyvesant Restoration Project. He was an advocate for issues related to human rights and social justice by traveling abroad to Eastern Europe, Latin America and South Africa, and formed working relationships with Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez and Walter Reuther. In 1968, Kennedy became a leading candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency by appealing to poor African American, Hispanic, Catholic and young voters. His main challenger in the race was Senator Eugene McCarthy. Shortly after winning the California primary around midnight on June 5, 1968, Kennedy was shot by Sian, a 25-year-old Palestinian, allegedly in retaliation for his support of Israel following the 1967 Six-Day War. Kennedy died 25 hours later. Sian was arrested, tried and convicted through Kennedy's assassination, like his brothers, continues to be the subject of widespread analysis and numerous conspiracy theories. Robert Francis Kennedy was born outside Boston in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, in November 20, 1925, to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a politician and a businessman, and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, a philanthropist and socialite. He was the seventh of their 9 children. His parents were members of 2 prominent Irish-American families that were active in the Massachusetts Democratic Party. All 4 of the Kennedys' grandparents were children of Irish immigrants. His 8 siblings were Joseph Jr., John, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Jean, and Ted. In September 1939, Kennedy began 8th grade at St. Paul's School, an elite Protestant private preparatory school for the boys in Concord, New Hampshire, that his father favored. Rose Kennedy was unhappy with the school's use of Protestant Bible. After 2 months, she took advantage of her ambassador husband's absence from Boston and withdrew Kennedy from St. Paul's and enrolled him in Portsmouth Priory School, a Benedictine Catholic boarding school for boys in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, which Kennedy attended for 8th through to 10th grade. Monks at Portsmouth Priory School regarded Robert as a moody and indifferent student. Father Damian Kearney, who was 2 classes behind Kennedy, reflected that he didn't look happy and he did not smile much. According to Kearney's review of school records, Kennedy was a poor to mediocre student except for history. In Kennedy's younger years, his father dubbed him the runt of the family and wrote wrote him off. Close family friend Lim Billings once remarked to Joe Sr. that Robert was the most generous little boy, and Joe Sr. replied that he did not know where his son got that. Billings commented that the only similarity between Robert and Joe Sr. was their eye color. As Robert grew, his father worried that he was soft on others, conflicting with his ideology. In response, Robert developed a tough persona that masked his gentle personality in attempting to appease his father. Biographer Judy Millis wrote that Joe Sr.'s lack of interest in Robert was evident by the length of time it took for him to decide to transfer him to Milton Academy. Both Joseph Jr. and John attended the exclusive Protestant preparatory school of Choate from their first year, while Robert was already a junior by the time he was enrolled at Milton. Despite his father's disdain, Kennedy continued to seek his approval, requesting that Joe Sr. write him a letter about his opinions on different political events and World War II. 6 weeks before his 18th birthday in 1943, Kennedy enlisted in the United States Naval Reserve as a seaman apprentice. He was released from active duty in March 1944 when he left Milton Academy early to report to the V-12 Navy College training program at Harvard College in Cambridge, Massachusetts from March to November 1944. He was relocated to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine from November 1944 to June 1945, where he received a specialized V-12 degree along with 15 others. During the college's winter carnival, Robert built a snow replica of a Navy boat. He returned to Harvard in June 1945, completing his post-training requirements in January 1946. In September 1946, Kennedy entered Harvard as a junior after receiving credit for his time in V-12 program. He worked hard to make the football team as an end. He was a starter and scored a touchdown in the first game of his senior year before breaking his leg in practice. He earned his varsity letter when his coach sent him in wearing a cast during the last minutes of a game against the Yale. In 1951, Kennedy was admitted to Massachusetts Bar that November. He moved with his wife to a townhouse in Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. and started working as a lawyer in the Internal Security Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, which prosecuted espionage and subversive activity cases. In February 1952, he was transferred to the Criminal Division to help prepare fraud cases against former officials of the Truman administration before Brooklyn grand jury. On 6 June 1952, he resigned to manage his brother John's U.S. Senate campaign in Massachusetts. JFK's victory was of great importance to the Kennedys, elevating him to the national prominence and turning him into a serious potential presidential candidate. John's victory was also equally important to Robert, who felt he had succeeded in eliminating his father's negative perceptions of him. In 1956, Kennedy moved his growing family outside Washington to a house called Hickory Hill, which he purchased from his brother John. This enormous 13-bedroom, 13-bath home was situated in 6 acres in McLean, Virginia. Kennedy went on to work as an aide to Adlai Stevenson during the 1956 presidential election, which helped him learn how national campaigns works in preparation for the future run by his brother John. Unimpressed with Stevenson, he reportedly voted for incumbent Dwight D. Eisenhower. Kennedy was also a Massachusetts delegate at the 1956 Democratic National Convention, having replaced Tip O'Neill at the request of his brother John, joining in what was ultimately an unsuccessful effort to help JFK get the vice presidential nomination. Shortly after this, following instructions by his father, Kennedy tried making amends with J. Edgar Hoover. There seemed to be some improvement in the interactions, which came to be seen as an elemental political necessity by Kennedy. This later changed after Kennedy was appointed Attorney General, where Hoover saw him as an unprecedented threat. In 1960, Kennedy published The Enemy Within, a book which described the corrupt practices within the Team Masters and other unions that had helped investigate John Seymour Thaler assisted Kennedy. Kennedy went to work on a presidential campaign of his brother John. In contrast to his role in his brother's previous campaign 8 years prior, Kennedy gave stump speeches throughout the primary season, gaining confidence as time went on. His strategy to win at any cost led him to call on Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. to attack Hubert Humphrey as a draft dodger. Roosevelt eventually did make the statement that Humphrey avoided service. After winning the 1960 presidential election, President-elect John F. Kennedy appointed his younger brother as U.S. Attorney General. The choice was controversial, with publications including the New York Times and the New Republic calling him inexperienced and unqualified. He had no experience in any state or federal court, causing the president to joke, "I can't see that it's wrong to give him legal experience. before he goes out to practice law, but Kennedy was early a novice as a lawyer, having gained significant experience conducting investigations and questioning witnesses as a Justice Department, Attorney and Senate Committee Counsel and Staff Director. Pressed by the Senate Judiciary Committee about his experience, Kennedy responded, "In my estimation, I think that I have had invaluable experience. I would not have given up 1 year of experience that I have had over the period since I graduated from the law school for experiencing practicing law in Boston." As Attorney General, Kennedy pursued a relentless crusade against organized crime and the mafia, sometimes disagreeing on strategy with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Through speeches and writing, Kennedy alerted the country to the existence of a private government of organized crime, which with annual income of billions resting on a base of human suffering and moral corrosion. He established the first coordinated program involving all 26 federal law enforcement agencies to investigate organized crime. In 1961, Kennedy worked to secure the passage of anti-racketeering legislation, Wire Act, Travel Act, and Interstate Transportation of Paraphernalia Act to prohibit interstate gambling. Federal Wire Act specifically targeted the use of wire communications and sought to disrupt the mafia's gambling operations. Convictions against organized crimes rose by 800%. During his term, Kennedy worked to shift Hoover's focus away from communism, which Hoover saw as a more serious threat to organized crime. According to James Neff, Kennedy's success in this endeavor was due to his brother's position, giving the Attorney General leverage over Hoover. Biographer Richard Hack concluded that Hoover's dislike for Kennedy came from his being unable to control him. In his first press conference as Attorney General in 1961, Kennedy spoke of an alarming increase in juvenile delinquency. In May 1969, Kennedy was named chairman of the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency and Youth Crime, PCJD, with lifelong friend David Hackett as director. After visits to blighted communities, Kennedy and Hackett concluded that delinquency was the result of racial discrimination and lack of opportunities. The community held that the government must impose solutions but empower the poor to develop their own. The PCJD provided comprehensive services, education, employment, and job training that encouraged self-sufficiency. In September 1961, the Juvenile Delinquency and Youth Offences Control Act was signed into law. Kennedy expressed the administration's commitment to civil rights during a May 6, 1961 speech at the University of Georgia Law School. At the president's direction, Kennedy used the power of federal agencies to influence the U.S. Steel not to institute a price increase, announcing a grand jury to investigate possible collusion and price fixing by a U.S. Steel in collaboration with other major steel manufacturers. The Wall Street Journal wrote that the administration had set prices of steel by naked power by threats by agents of the state security police. Yale law professor Charles Reich wrote in A New Republic that the Justice Department had violated civil liberties by calling a federal grand jury to indict a U.S. Steel so quickly, then disbanded it after the price increase did not occur. As one of the president's closest White House advisors, Kennedy played a role in the events surrounding the Berlin crisis of 1961, operating mainly through a private back-channel connection to Soviet GRU officer Georgy Bolshakov. He relayed important diplomatic communications between the US and Soviet governments. Most significantly, this connection helped the US set up Vienna Summit in June 1961, and later to defuse the tank standoff with the Soviets at Berlin's checkpoint Charlie in October. Kennedy's visit with his wife to West Berlin in February 1962 demonstrated US support for the city and helped repair the strained relationship between the administration and its special envoy in Berlin. As his brother's confidant, Kennedy oversaw the CIA's anti-Castro's activities after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. He also helped develop the strategy during the Cuban Missile Crisis to placate Cuba instead of initiating a military strike that might have led to the nuclear war. At the summit meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda in Washington, D.C. in 1961, President Kennedy promised to make a reciprocal visit to Japan in 1962, but the decision to resume atmospheric nuclear testing forced him to postpone such a visit, and he sent Robert in instead. Kennedy and his wife Ethel arrived in Tokyo in February 1962 at a very sensitive time in US-Japan relations, shortly after the massive UNPO protest against the US-Japan Security Treaty had highlighted anti-American grievances. Kennedy won over a highly spectacled Japanese public and the press with his cheerful, open demeanor, sincerity, and youthful energy. Most famously, Kennedy scored a public relations coup during a national televised speech at Waseda University in Tokyo, when radical Marxist student activists from Zengakuren attempted to shoot him down. He calmly invited one of them on stage and engaged the student in an impromptu debate. Kennedy's calmness and the defiant willingness to take the student's question seriously won many admirers in Japan and praised from the Japanese media, both for himself and on his brother's behalf. When President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963, RFK was at home with his aides from the Justice Department. J. Edgar Hoover called and told him his brother had been shot. Hoover then hung up before he could ask any questions. Kennedy later said he thought Hoover had enjoyed telling him the news. Kennedy then received a call from Tazewell Shepard, a naval aide to the president, who told him that his brother was dead. Shortly after the call from Hoover, Kennedy phoned McGeorge Bundy at the White House, instructing him to change the locks on the president's file. He ordered the Secret Service to dismantle the hidden tapping system in the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room. He scheduled a meeting with CIA Director John McCone and asked if the CIA had any involvement in his brother's death. McCone denied it, with Kennedy later telling investigator Walter Sheridan that he had asked the director in a way that he couldn't lie to me, and they, the CIA, hadn't. In the wake of the assassination of his brother and Lyndon Johnson's ascension to the presidency with the office of vice president now vacant, Kennedy was viewed favorably as a potential candidate for the position in the 1964 presidential election. Several Kennedy partisans called for him and to be drafted in the tribute to his brother. National polling showed that three or four Democrats were in favor of him as Johnson's running mate. Democratic organizers supported him as the write-in candidate in the New Hampshire primary. In March 1964, more than 25,000 Democrats wrote in Kennedy's name, only 3,700 fewer than the number of Democrats who wrote in Johnson's name as their choice for president. 9 months after his brother's assassination, Kennedy left the cabinet to run for a seat in the U.S. Senate representing New York, announcing his candidacy on August 25, 1964. 2 days before to the end of that year's Democratic National Convention, he had considered the possibility of running for the seat since early spring, but also giving consideration for governor of Massachusetts, or he had put it, go away, leaving politics altogether after the plane crash and injury of his brother Ted in June 2 months earlier. Positive reception in Europe convinced him to remain in politics. Kennedy was lauded during trips to Germany and Poland. The denizens of the latter's country greetings to Kennedy being interrupted by learning as evaporating the agony he had sustained since his brother's passing. Contemplating Kennedy's political future, Milton Guitzman, a speechwriter, reminded him, "You are going to receive invitations to attend dedications and speak around the country and abroad, and to undertake other activities in connection with President Kennedy. And it will seem easier to do this as a U.S. Senator based in Washington, D.C. than as a governor based in Boston." On September 1st, the New York State Democratic Committee gave Kennedy permission to run amid mixed feelings about his candidacy. Despite their notoriously difficult relationship, Johnson gave considerable support to Kennedy's campaign. The New York Times editorialized that there is nothing illegal about the possible nomination of Robert F. Kennedy of Massachusetts as senator from New York, but there is plenty of cynical about it, merely choosing the state as a convenient launching pad for the political ambitions of himself. Kennedy could not run for the U.S. Senate from his native Massachusetts because his younger brother Ted was running for re-election in 1964. Kennedy drew attention in Congress early on as the brother of President Kennedy, which set him apart from other senators. He drew more than 50 senators as spectators when he delivered a speech in the Senate on nuclear proliferation in June 1965. But he also saw a decline in his power, going from the president's most influential advisor to one of 100 senators, and this impatience with collaborative lawmaking showed. Though fellow Senator Fred H.R. Harris expected not to like Kennedy, the two became allies. Harris even called them each other's best friends in the Senate. Kennedy's younger brother Ted was his senior there. Robert saw his brother as a guide on managing within the Senate, and the arrangement worked to deepen their relationship. Harris noted that Kennedy was intense about matters and issues that concerned him. Kennedy gained a reputation in the Senate for being well prepared for debate, but his tendency to speak to other senators in a more blunt fashion caused him to be unpopular with many of his colleagues. The JFK administration backed the U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world in the frame of the Cold War, but Kennedy was not known to be involved in the discussions of the Vietnam War as his brother's Attorney General. According to historian Doris Kearns Godwin, before his choosing to run for the Senate, Kennedy had sought an ambassadorship to South Vietnam. Entering the Senate, Kennedy initially kept private his disagreements with President Johnson on the war. While Kennedy vigorously supported his brother's earlier efforts, never publicly advocated commitment of ground troops. Though bothered by the beginning of the bombing of North Vietnam in February 1965, Kennedy did not wish to appear antagonistic toward the president's agenda. But by April, Kennedy was advocating a halt of the bombing to Johnson, who acknowledged that Kennedy played a part in influencing his choice to temporarily cease bombing the following month. Kennedy cautioned Johnson against sending combat troops as early as 1965, but Johnson chose instead to follow the recommendation of the rest of his predecessors' still intact staff of advisors. In July, after Johnson made a large commitment of American ground forces to Vietnam, Kennedy made multiple calls for a settlement through negotiation. In a letter to Senator Kennedy the following month, John Paul Vann, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, wrote that Kennedy indicated comprehension of the problems we face. In December 1965, Kennedy advised his friend, the Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, that he should counsel Johnson to declare a ceasefire in Vietnam. A bombing pause over North Vietnam and to take up an offer by Algeria to serve as a honest broker in peace talks, the left-wing Algerian government had friendly relations with the North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front and had indicated in 1965 to 1966 that it was willing to serve as a conduit for peace talks, but most of the Johnson's advisors were leery of the Algerian offer. In 1968, Johnson prepared to run for re-election. In January, faced with widely considered unrealistic race against the incumbent president, Kennedy said he would not seek the presidency. After the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in early February 1968, he received a letter from the writer Peter Hamill that said poor people kept pictures of President Kennedy on their walls and that Kennedy had an obligation of staying true to whatever it was that put those pictures on those walls. Kennedy scored major victories when he won both the California and South Dakota primaries on June 4th. He addressed his supporters shortly after midnight on June 5th, 1968, in a ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Leaving the ballroom, he went through the hotel kitchen after being told it was a shortcut to a press room. He did this despite being advised by his bodyguard, former FBI agent Bill Barry, to avoid the kitchen in a crowded kitchen passageway. Kennedy turned to his left and shook hands with hotel busboy Juan Romero, just as Sian, a 25-year-old Palestinian, opened fire with a .22 caliber revolver. Kennedy was hit 3 times and 5 other people were wounded. Kennedy's body was returned to Manhattan, where it lay in repose at St. Patrick's Cathedral from approximately 10 p.m. until 10 a.m. on June 8. A high requiem mass was held at the cathedral at 10 a.m. on June 8. The service was attended by members of the extended Kennedy family, President Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, and members of the Johnson cabinet. Ted, the only surviving Kennedy brother, said more about his brother. Kennedy was buried close to his brother John in Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Although he had always maintained that he wished to be buried in Massachusetts, his family believed Robert should be interred in Arlington next to his brother. The procession left Union Station and passed the new Senate office building, where he had offices, and then proceeded to Lincoln Memorial White Post. The Marine Corps band played the battle hymn of the Republic. The funeral motorcade arrived at the cemetery at 10:24 p.m. As the vehicles entered the cemetery, people lining the roadway spontaneously lit the candles to guide the motorcade to the burial site. On June 17, 1950, Kennedy married socialite Ethel Skakel, the third daughter of businessman George and Anne Skakel, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. The couple had 11 children: Kathleen in 1951, Joseph in 1952, Robert Jr. in 1954, David in 1955, Mary Courtney in 1956, Michael in 1958, Mary Carey in 1959, Christopher in 1963, Matthew in 1965, Douglas in 1967, and Rory in 1968. Kennedy was said to be gentlest and shyest of the family, as well as the least articulate verbally. By the time he was a young boy, his grandmother, Josiah Frisgald, worried he would become a sissy. His mother had a similar concern, as he was the smallest and tiniest. But soon afterward, the family discovered there was no fear of that. Family friend Lem Billings met Kennedy when he was 8 years old and later reflect that he loved him, adding that Kennedy was the nicest little boy I have ever met. Billings also said Kennedy was barely noticed in the early days, but that's because he didn't bother anybody. Whereas NSC became the nurse for the Kennedy children when Kennedy was 12, calling him the most thoughtful and considerate of his siblings. Kennedy's Catholicism was central to his politics and personal attitude to life and its purpose. He inherited this faith from his family. He was more religious than his brothers and approached his duties with a Catholic worldview. He faithfully attended Catholic Mass and often stepped over the rail to help out if he saw that an altar boy was missing and the priest needed a hand. John Stetler, a writer, remarked that Kennedy had a strange fascination with the Polish nation, being impressed with the Polish struggle for independence and their deep commitment to Catholicism. Kennedy was the first sibling of a president of the United States to serve as a U.S. Attorney General. Biographer Evan Thomas wrote that at times Kennedy misused his powers by modern standards, but concluded on the whole, even counting his words, he was a great Attorney General. Walter Isaacson commented that Kennedy turned out arguably to be the best Attorney General in history, praising him for his championing of civil rights. Turned out arguably to be the best Attorney General in history, praising him for his championing of civil rights and other initiatives of the administration. As Kennedy stepped down from being Attorney General in 1964 to other initiatives of the administration, as Kennedy stepped down from being Attorney General in 1964 to assume the office of the Senator from New York, the New York Times, notably having criticized his appointment 3 years prior, praised Kennedy for raising the standard of position. Some of his successor Attorney Generals have been favorably compared to him for not displaying the same level of the poise in the profession. Near the end of his time in office as Attorney General under Barack Obama, Eric Holder cited Kennedy as the inspiration for his belief that the Justice Department could be a force for that which is right. In the months and years after Robert F. Kennedy's death, numerous roads, public schools, and other facilities across the United States had been named in his memory.